Hello, fictional. Welcome to the What If Issei. Today we are gonna see, what if Issei embraced the life of a mercenary? Part 1. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. The cold wind bit at his skin as he walked down the street. The winter was blisteringly cold this year. He slipped on a small patch of ice and landed on his back. Issei lay there, staring at the dull gray sky as he tried to remember exactly how he ended up like this. After his banishment, he was forced to flee north to the Niigata prefecture of Japan. The last of his money dried up just as he reached the capital of the region, the city of Niigata itself. The young devil has been left starving and poor, stripped of everything he has ever known except the clothes on his back. Suddenly Issei heard footsteps approaching him. A woman with deep violet hair leaned over him, so much potential, she muttered as she stared at him. You look like you could use a second chance. I'm willing to offer, under certain circumstances of course. Issei's head was spinning from hunger and exhaustion. For his days, he let out a tired okay. The woman smiled, all right then, she affirmed cheerfully. She put her index finger to the young man's forehead and he was asleep within seconds. Issei woke up in a warm bed for the first time in weeks. He groaned and looked around as he gained his bearings. The first thing he noticed was that the room was not too different from his own at his parents' house, sans the lewd posters. It was simply furnished with a desk, closet, and bed. Soft light flooded through the only window and bathed the room in a warm yellow. He got up and noticed the clothes folded neatly on the desk. The young devil changed and soon found himself wearing a pair of jeans with a plain red shirt. As he was pulling on the black windbreaker, the door opened and a middle-aged man walked in. "Ah, good, you're awake," he said in a friendly manner. The man was dressed in a button-down shirt and jeans. He had short, spiked blonde hair and matching stubble growing on his face. "Nice to meet you, the name's Connor," the man said as he extended his hand. "Issei," the devil said as he shook Connor's hand. "I see what Sarutobi meant, you do seem to have potential," Connor said as he looked him over. "What do you mean?" Issei asked. "The woman that brought you here, she said you might be a valuable asset. I hate to say it, but she just might be right." "Well, I never thought I would see the day that you would admit I'm right," a woman's voice called out from the doorway. The purple-haired woman from before was leaning against the frame. "Good to see you awake, Issei-kun," she said. "How do you know my name?" Issei questioned. "Well, I looked through your wallet of course," she explained as if the answer was obvious. "What the hell? You can't just go through someone's stuff like that," he yelled. "Relax, it's not like there was anything to steal anyway. You seemed half dead when I found you, when was the last time you ate?" she asked. "Not for a while," Issei admitted, "I don't really have the cash for it at the moment." "That's an understatement," she murmured, "just come downstairs once you finished getting dressed, we have breakfast waiting." At the prospect of food, Issei's eyes lit up. "Really?" he asked hungrily, his mouth already watering. "Follow me," the woman chuckled. A minute later, Issei sat at a table in front of a feast of bacon, eggs, and waffles, while Connor and the purple-haired woman sat in two of the remaining 4 chairs. "So I suppose I should start by introducing myself," the woman said. "My name is Sarutobi AM, everyone here just calls me Sachan." "Why did you bring me here?" Issei asked before shoving a syrup cake piece of waffle in his mouth. "I sensed a great deal of magical energy within you," Sarutobi explained. "We thought you would make a wonderful addition to our little business here." Issei paused halfway through devouring a piece of bacon. "So they know about the magical world, huh?" he thought to himself. "And what business would that be?" he asked. Sarutobi smiled. "We're fixers," she explained. "We take on a wide variety of jobs, some not as upstanding as others. We are a relatively small organization, but we are making a name for ourselves rather quickly. We get some high-profile clientele and have the respect of our customers." She leaned forward. "We have also been looking to expand. When I saw you on the street back there I knew you were a prime candidate. The style equals font family times font size medium." Issei shook his head. "Sorry to tell you this, but most of my magical circuits are shot. I can't even use a fraction of the magic I was once capable of." Sarutobi smiled. "Well, that is a shame, I think you still can be of use. Although magic can be extraordinarily helpful, it is not a necessity in many of the jobs we receive." Issei paused to think for a moment. "How much money could you make in this line of work?" "You could walk away a rich man," Connor said. "You honestly have very many options. We're offering you a good deal, it would be a shame to have to send you back out onto the street," Sarutobi added. Issei sighed. "Okay. I'll need to hear more before I come to a decision, but I'm willing to give it a shot," he relented. "Wonderful." Sarutobi cheered. "You won't regret this, I can assure you." She smiled at him. "Welcome to the company, Issei. Good to have you on the team," Connor said. "Believe me when I say you made a good decision." Sarutobi nodded. "Once you finish eating we can discuss the finer points of what a job in our organization entails." After Issei had finished his breakfast, they moved into a small living room with 2 couches with a glass table between them and a flat-screen TV. The young devil sat on one couch while his new coworkers sat across from him. Right then, Saratobi began, due to the fact that we don't have some boring introductory video lying around, I'll go over everything for you. Our organization is called Kronos. At the moment we are comprised of 6 members, including you. Isn't that a bit small? Issei asked. Not at all, the way we function makes a smaller group better than a large company. It's like this with most fixer groups, Saratobi explained. When one of us takes a job, the reward is shared equally with the rest of us. This ensures that everyone gets a paycheck and that no one can monopolize the larger jobs for their own gain. Make no mistake though, Connor added, everyone has to pull their weight here. If you aren't making any money, we cut you off the payroll. Saratobi smiled, we find it best when there is no fighting over how to split the earnings of each job. This system we have has worked so far and we expect you to follow it. This company also has its fair share of rules, she continued, all jobs you take on as a fixer must be reported to the company and the earnings shared. We don't take on freelancers and will not tolerate hoarding. If we find you doing either of these, we'll kick your ass out of here faster than Connor can drain the coffee pot. Issei nodded, sounds reasonable. Great. Saratobi clapped her hands together, with any luck we can set you up with a job before the weekends, so you can test the water. For now you can just lounge around here while we wait for the rest of the team to come back. With that, Connor and Saratobi got up and went to their respective rooms. Issei headed back up to the room he had woken up in. In one of the 2 drawers attached to the desk he found his phone and its charger. He probably should have sold the thing long ago, but he couldn't stand to part with all the precious photos it held of his past life. He opened up the phone and scrolled through the various pictures his friends from Rias' peerage. Eventually he came upon a photo of the Gremory beauty herself, smiling up at him through the screen. He couldn't help but remember his last time seeing her. Issei stood before the council, his hands in chains, the bloody shed from the battle still wet on his clothes. As a being whose strength had grown to rival the biblical gods, he led the defense of the demon world capital against Chaos Brigade's last attack. While they had won, largely due to his efforts, the losses had been too heavy. The amount of civilian casualties was staggering. The innocent had been caught in the crossfire and decimated by their battle, and now the survivors called for retribution. With all of Chaos Brigade dead or fleeing, they set their sights on Issei. It is impossible to say that he wasn't at least partly to blame. Had he kept them from entering the city as he was told to, the death toll would have been far smaller. Issei Hyoudou, middle-class devil, pawn of Rias' Gremory, Seraphol Leviathan announced in a voice devoid of emotion, you have been charged with the murder of hundreds of pure blood and reincarnated devils. The silence in the room was suffocating. The failure on your part to halt the advance of Chaos Brigade and the resulting conflict, with you as its main combatant, cost the lives of these innocent individuals. He could feel their stares, most filled with hatred, but a very select few knew he didn't deserve punishment. Your past services to Devil Society have been taken into account and we have settled on your sentence. Issei could hear Seraphol take a shaky breath, her stoic facade threatening to break and allow her tears to fall, as she condemned one of the few people that have earned her true respect and she has come to call a friend. You will be banished from the devil world, your status among our hierarchy removed, and your position as a pawn in the service of Rias' Gremory revoked. She stated, as head of affairs on this council, I declare this verdict final. Everything was a blur from then on. The shock of the entire situation turned Issei numb. 2 uniformed devils had dragged him out of the courtroom through a large set of double doors. Hundreds of devils waited for him outside, screaming and cursing him. However, through all this, one moment was burned into his memory. Through the crowd he could see Rias, his beautiful master, crying and screaming his name as she stretched out her hand to reach for him. Serziches held her back with a look of defeat evident on his face. Issei was shoved into a metal cart designed for prisoners, and the Gremory heiress's desperate face disappeared from sight. The sudden tap on the shoulder jolted Issei out of the memory and back into his new room. One look out the window told him that hours had passed and the sun was beginning to set. Issei? The rest of the team is waiting downstairs, Saratobi said. Alright, I'll be down in a second, he replied. You okay? Saratobi asked with worry in her voice. I'm fine, Sachan, just a bit of reminiscing. Saratobi nodded understandingly, you'll find that the past isn't something this group is very keen on remembering. We all have our stories. If you ever feel like talking about yours, my door is always open. Issei smiled at her, thanks, that means a lot. But that they both headed downstairs to meet the rest of Kronos. Issei didn't know exactly what to expect of fixers beyond Saratobi and Connor, but the first thought that struck him was how normal they looked. There wasn't anything too remarkable about them. You could pass by one of them on the street and not spare them a second glance, a far cry from the unique characters in Rias' peerage. The remaining members of Kronos were made up of 1 woman and 2 men. The woman had jet black hair and piercing blue eyes, she looked like she was in her early 20s, she was slightly shorter than Issei and wore tight black jeans with a white tank top and a brown leather jacket. She examined Issei with an analytical gaze that made him feel like he was being picked apart, judged for his worth, and put back together again all at once. It made the young devil feel uneasy. She extended her hand towards him and he shook it. "My name is Kumiko," she said. The entire time, her expression hadn't changed in the slightest. The next person to address Issei was the man next to her. He had brown hair, and his eyes were a dull amber. He looked to be around the same age as Issei, somewhere in his early 20s as well, much like Sarutobi and Haru. He maintained an apathetic look as he nodded his head toward Issei and introduced himself. "I'm Train Hyoudou." The final member was by far the oldest. He seemed to be in his later 40s with the edges of his soft black hair turning a lighter shade of gray. He was taller than the other members of Kronos and had a muscular build that reminded Issei of a soldier. "Yona Hekmatyr," he said warmly. "These are the people you're going to be working with from now on, Issei," Connor said. "I managed to set up a fairly simple job for you in a couple days. Train will be working with you on this one so he can fill you in on the details." Train gave a nod. "Alright then," Sarutobi began. "It had been a long day for everyone, especially you guys," she said, pointing to the 3 members of Kronos that had just returned. "I say we all head to bed and talk more over breakfast." The members nodded their approval and headed to their own rooms for a night of rest. Sarutobi turned to Issei smiling. "So what do you think? They may not come off as the most hospitable of people, but they do good work. I'm sure they'll grow on you eventually." Issei nodded. "I look forward to it," he said. Afterwards, he headed back to his room and fell down onto his bed. So many things had happened in one day. One moment he had been homeless and poor, but now he had a job and a warm bed to sleep in. The life of an outcast sure is strange. For the first time in weeks, Issei woke up with a full night's rest. As his eyes slowly slid open, he put a hand in front of his face to stop the light pouring in from the window from blinding him. A thin layer of frost covered the world outside in white. Issei swung his legs off his bed and put his shirt and pants on. He walked downstairs and saw Train sitting at the table eating from a bowl of cereal and milk. "Morning," Issei called out. "Morning," Train replied. The fixer put down his spoon and looked up at Issei. "Now may be a good time to talk about the job we have tomorrow," he said. "Alright, let's hear it," Issei said as he sat down across from his coworker. "Sarutobi set us up with something pretty simple. We got rich dad, a big wig in some lumber company, and his daughter. So the daughter went and ran away with some older guy. The guy goes by the name T-Dog on the street," Train said. "Apparently, the guy carries around a piece, nearly put a bullet in dear old daddy when he tried to convince his daughter to come home. Apparently daughter dearest wants to stay with this prick, it's our job to bring her back." "You guys take on these kinds of jobs?" Issei asked. "We're fixers, we take on any job that pays and is within our range of capability," Train explained. "How much is this one going to pay?" the devil asked. "The client is offering 7,000 in American dollars, pocket change once we split it among the group, but a good place for you to start," Train replied. As he finished explaining, Haru came down from the stairs and walked into the kitchen. Suddenly a thought came to Issei. "Hey Train, Sarutobi said that magic isn't something we need to do these jobs, but do you use any?" Issei inquired. Train spared him a thoughtful glance. "I prefer to not use magic on most occasions. I say that if you can't do a job without magic, you shouldn't be doing it at all. It is pretty helpful when you're in a pinch though." "What kind of magic do you use?" Issei asked. "I can't use many types of magic, but I can alter the speed my body moves at. It lets me move, aim, and shoot faster. Haru over there has a whole arsenal of magic, especially healing, she has a natural talent for it." At this Haru stopped rummaging through the refrigerator in the kitchen and turned to them for a moment with a piece of bread hanging from her mouth. She gave a quick nod towards Issei before continuing to pillage the company's food supply. "Anyway," Train continued, "this job should be quick and easy, I doubt we'll even need any magic while we're out there." After they talking a bit more about how Kronos functions, Connor came down for breakfast. "Issei. I meant to ask you, did you want to check out the city? I doubt you got to see it very well without any money." Issei laughed half-heartedly. "Yeah sure." Great, the blonde said, "Let me just grab something to eat and we can hop in the car and go." 5 minutes later, Issei and Connor had both gotten into a plain black sedan and set off for the city. Niigata is the largest city in this prefecture. The prefecture itself has around 2.5 million people in it, almost as many as Kyoto, Connor explained. The city itself is huge, you should just see the skyline at night. Issei stared out at the towering buildings around the city, leading all the way to the ocean on the western side of Japan. "This city is the base of our operations, it's where we keep the headquarters. However, it is pretty common to get jobs that require us to go to other districts in Japan, or even out of the country," Connor pointed out. "Hell, just last week I was in Pakistan. Barely made it out of that place alive, took a bullet to the thigh for my efforts." They pulled up to a fancy hotel close to the center of the city. "This is where your for tomorrow is staying," he said. "I'm pretty sure he wants you to deliver his daughter somewhere around this location. I doubt he wants you to drag her inside the hotel though. High-profile clients like this prefer not to make a scene. That's usually why they hire us, we're discreet and stay out of the public eye." After a few more hours of sightseeing, the two fixers stopped at a McDonald's to get lunch. "So what do you think of the city, Issei?" Connor asked. "It's amazing, the town I used to live in was nothing like this," he replied. "Really? I'm used to this kind of thing, I grew up in New York. Came over here about 5 years back and took odd jobs around the city. Around 3 years ago I found my place in Kronos," Connor said. "I thought your name sounded American," Issei remarked. Connor looked at his watch. "We've been out longer than I thought, you want to head back?" "Alright," Issei replied. They left the McDonald's and traveled home. "Hey. Good to see you guys back," Saratobi greeted them from the kitchen as they walked through the door. "Eru and Jonah just left on a job," she said. "What job?" Connor asked. "The one up in the Amori prefecture," she replied. "Are you sure it was okay to send just the two of them?" he asked. "Of course. They'll be fine," Saratobi said as cheerful as always. "How do you feel about your job, Issei?" Issei smiled. "I'm excited to start," he said. "Wonderful, with Train as your partner it should go by without a hitch," she said. Later that night, Issei lay awake on his bed and went through the pictures of his old life again. He truly had a wonderful time back then. He was surrounded by beautiful girls, had the power to match the biblical god in a fight, and a place he belonged. All of that was gone now. After his evil pieces were taken from him, Issei lost a huge portion of his power. The pieces were forcefully ripped from his body, so many of his magical circuits were destroyed. As a result, he could hardly summon any magic at all, even the most basic techniques were difficult. By far the worst part in all of this was his inability to contact Dreg. Before he was turned into a devil, it was impossible for Issei to talk to the Dragon Emperor. With his meager supply now, he may never speak to him again. On the bright side, he did get to keep his devilhood. Initially he had thought that removing a reincarnated devil's pieces was a death sentence, or at the very least they would revert to being a normal human. He managed to retain his status as a devil, including the enhanced strength and speed. As the warm embrace of sleep took him, he couldn't help but wonder if he might be able to build himself up again with Kronos. Issei was woken up by a hit to the ribs. He got tangled up in his blanket and wrestled with it on the floor as he regained his motor functions after a long night's sleep. Once he finally dislodged himself, he looked up and saw Train standing on his bed smirking at him, his legs still in the air after kicking Issei off. "Morning," he said. "What the hell? Who does that to their partner?" "Well, it's time to get up, we have a job to do," Train said casually. Issei sat up. "Oh, right," he remarked. "When do we go?" 15 minutes, Train replied. "Be ready by then, or I'll be delivering you wake-up calls for the next month." Issei shuddered at the thought. "Alright, I'll be downstairs in a second," he replied. After getting dressed, Issei walked down and into the living room where Train waited. He had a black coat on over his usual attire. It was open in the front, revealing his shirt underneath and reached down to just above his knees. He was tapping his foot impatiently as he leaned against the wall. He looked over to Issei. "Took you long enough," he said as he reached into his coat and pulled out a pistol. "Dear," he said, offering Issei the gun. "A fixer should never work without a weapon, you never know when a job will go south." Issei took the gun and noticed the words Glock 17 on the end of the square slide. He felt uneasy as he took the weapon. "I've never shot one of these before," he said. Train smirked at him once again. "Well then maybe we can get some practice in while we're on the job, eh?" The idea of killing wasn't exactly new to Issei. He had killed members of Chaos Brigade during his battle at the Devil Capital and exterminated plenty of stray devils with his peerage. This was different though. More often than not he wouldn't know if the people he was aiming at were truly evil, at least not in this line of work. The young devil steeled his nerves and put the gun in the back of his waistband. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it. "Connor is letting us use his car for this one, let's go," Train said as he walked out the door. They both climbed in the same black sedan Issei and Connor had used to drive around the city yesterday. "Remember, we want to remain inconspicuous," Train reminded him. "Go in, get the girl, get out. With any luck we won't run into anyone along the way." After driving for 10 minutes, Issei and Train arrived at the poorer districts on the outskirts of Niigata. Issei could see graffiti on the walls and boards over the windows and doors of the small houses throughout the area. Eventually, they pulled up in front of a small house with bars placed over its windows and front door, not unlike most other houses in the area. "We're here," Train said, and proceeded to park the car across the street and get out. Loud music could be heard coming from inside as they walked up to the residence. Train crept up and put his ear to the door. After a moment he looked around to make sure no one was watching and smashed the lock of the door with the butt of his pistol. He holstered the weapon and glanced back at Issei. "Let's go," he said and walked into the house. The inside of the house was a mess. The lights were dimmed, clothes were strewn about, and a torn-up sofa could be seen in the corner. Issei looked around and couldn't help but notice the thin layer of smoke in the air. Train walked to another door in the back of the room. The door opened up to a bedroom where a girl around their age could be seen. Is that you?" she called out. She seemed to be in a daze, probably due to the syringes and dirty plastic spoons that could be seen littering the floor. The girl looked as though she was normally beautiful, but right now her hair was unkempt and her eyes glazed. Train walked over and prepared to lift her up. Just then, the front door swung open to reveal a heavily tattooed man. He took one look at the fixers, and his face twisted into an ugly glare, the veins could be seen bulging in his neck past all the ink. He dropped the small McDonald's bag he had been holding and brandished a pistol. Suddenly, faster than the eye could see, Train drew his own weapon and fired. The shot went straight through the man's right temple and out the back of his head. The sickening sound of blood splattering against the floor resounded throughout the room. For a single instant, all sounds seemed to disappear. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. Then it began again, with all of its fury. The girl let loose an ear-piercing scream. The music continued to pound in Issei's skull and gave him a headache. The world seemed to spin. Train leapt into action at that moment. The fixer grabbed both Issei and the girl and dragged them outside. He threw the girl in the trunk and Issei and in the passenger's seat and drove. That was a human, Issei thought to himself, not a stray devil or one of Chaos Brigade's magic users, but a human that had no knowledge of angels, devils, or anything from our world. Once the car stopped, Issei opened the door, fell on his knees and threw up. The bile stung his throat and his eyes burned. After Issei had spent a few minutes on his hands and knees outside the car, Train came around behind him. "You done yet?" he asked coolly. "This is the job, get used to it." The rest of the job went smoothly. They delivered the girl to the designated drop-off and reunited her with her father. Once the fixers were paid, they began the journey home. The entire time not a single word was spoken between Train and Issei. After arriving back at the house, Train went to the kitchen for a drink, while the young devil went straight to his room. An hour later, Issei's door creaked open. Sarutobi walked in and put a hand on his shoulder. "Train gave me a full report," she said. "Are you alright?" Issei gave a short nod. "Yeah," he croaked, "I just wasn't prepared for that. I've had to kill before but never in cold blood like that." Sarutobi moved her hand in a circle on the small of his back. "It's okay," she whispered, "no one is ever ready for that. But you have to understand that this is part of the job. We try to avoid killing innocent people, but sometimes it can't be helped." I understand," Issei replied. "Good. Get some rest, okay?" Issei nodded and Sarutobi walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. After that, Issei drifted into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, buttered toast and a grinning Connor greeted the young devil as he walked into the kitchen. "You want one?" Connor asked as he held a plate up to Issei. "Thanks," Issei said as he took the plate, still rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. After they had both sat down with their plates, Connor looked up at Issei. "So Train tells us you've never fired a gun before," the blonde fixer remarked. "Yeah," Issei admitted, "guns aren't very common in Japan, so I never had the opportunity." "Don't worry, Sachan volunteered to take you out for shooting lessons today." "That's right," Sarutobi said as she walked down the stairs. "We'll be leaving in a little bit, so finish up there and get ready." Issei quickly ate his toast and headed upstairs to put on clean clothes. He went over to his desk and picked up the gun he had deposited there the night before. He looked at it hesitantly before shoving it into the back of his pants and slipping on his windbreaker. He walked back down the stairs and out to a silver truck Sarutobi was waiting in. "We're going down south toward the bottom of the prefecture," she said. "We can't have too many people around when you're firing off shots." Issei got in the truck and they drove for 2 hours. He watched as small houses in the rural area of the region faded into the distance. Eventually he began to drive through a more wooded area as trees began to envelop the landscape. "This looks good enough," Sarutobi said as she pulled the truck to a stop. Issei got out and observed the area. They were at the edge of a small forest. Behind them stretched a long plain of grass with trees dotting the landscape. Other than the narrow road they had arrived on, there was no sign of civilization as far as the eye could see. A light fog had settled in the cold evening, and the sun couldn't be seen past the dull gray hue the sky had adopted. Sarutobi retrieved a paper target from the bed of the truck and pinned it to a tree. Once she was sure it was secure, she walked back over to Issei and stood beside him. "Alright, let's see where you're at. Try shooting that target over there." Issei pulled his gun out and took aim at the target. He waited until he felt the shot was lined up just right and pulled the trigger. The bullet flew out of the chamber with an ear-splitting crack. It clipped the edge of the paper target and flew into a tree further in the forest. "Not terrible," Sarutobi remarked as she took the gun out of Issei's hands, "but it needs a lot of work." She slipped the magazine out of the gun and pulled the slide back to eject the bullet out of the chamber. "Now that you've had a chance to fire it, let's review," she said. "The gun you just shot is a Glock 17 with a threaded barrel. It fires a 9mm bullet at 350 meters per second. Not first choice, but it gets the job done." She let the slide fall back into place and put the gun back in Issei's hand. "Aim the gun just like you were earlier," she demanded. Issei got into the same stance he was in moments ago. "Keep your elbows relaxed," Sarutobi instructed. She put her hand over Issei's. "Keep your left thumb under your right when you fire," she said, while moving his fingers into place. She leaned forward, pressing her chest into Issei's arm. "Make sure you line up the sights correctly." Issei's face grew red slightly at the close contact. Right, he replied and adjusted his stance. "Good, that's perfect," she said with a smile. She proceeded to show Issei how to load rounds into a magazine, as well as how to insert and eject the magazine from the gun. "When you're ready, try firing the gun again," Sarutobi said. Issei nodded and brought the gun up toward the target once more. He mimicked what she had shown him and fired. The round hit home 3 rings out from the center of the target. "Great job," she praised. They continued to discuss the mechanics behind the gun and firing practice rounds for hours. Eventually, the sun began to set and they were running low on ammunition. "I think that's good for the day." "You're a fast learner," Issei, Sarutobi said. They collected the targets they had gone through and got back into the truck. "We'll keep practicing, you're getting better, but I'm not confident in pitting you against live and moving targets," she explained. Issei nodded and they began the long journey home. The following week, Issei and Sarutobi went out to practice shooting 3 separate times. Issei was steadily gaining progress and could manage to hit a still target from a good distance away easily. As they walked in through the door of the house after another session, Connor came up to Sarutobi with a worried look on his face. "Have you heard anything from Hyoudou and Jonah?" he asked. "They haven't reported back for a couple of days now." A frown formed on Sarutobi's face. "No, I haven't," she muttered. She turned towards the young devil standing beside her. "Issei, get trained from upstairs. I want you two ready to move within the hour," she ordered. "They wouldn't miss a report without a good reason. I want you guys prepared to support just in case." She turned to Connor. "Get me their last known location," she said. Connor nodded and hurried over to the laptop he had left open on the kitchen table. After Issei arrived at the kitchen with train in tow, Sarutobi tossed them the keys to the sedan. "Start driving up to the Amori prefecture. Hyoudou and Jonah are in trouble." Within minutes, the 2 male fixers were on the road. As Issei began driving, Train called Sarutobi from the passenger's seat. While the number was dialing, he hooked up his phone to the port in the car. When she picked up, Sarutobi immediately began briefing them. Hyoudou and Jonah took a job eliminating an elite of the local Yakuza in the Amori prefecture, she began. "The man's name is Koyashi Takeyama. The price on his head is 540 grand in American dollars." Issei took a left turn onto the highway, traveling north toward Yamagata and past that, Amori. "There have been recent reports of gang shootouts that coincide with the time and location of our last communication with Hyoudou and Jonah," she continued. "If they aren't dead, then they are most likely holed up somewhere and hiding. Either way, you're bringing them home." "Got it," Train confirmed. "Good luck out there, boys." But that the call ended and they drove in silence. 4 hours later they crossed into Amori. "Alright, Sachan sent me the address of their last known location," Train said. "Looks like they were somewhere in the suburbs, just outside of the city. A lot of apartment buildings in this area, so finding them might prove to be a real bitch." As they approached the address, the street seemed to grow devoid of life and eerily quiet. "Dear," Train said as they pulled up in front of a large apartment complex. They got out of the car and slowly made their way to the building. Issei heard a distant crack and suddenly he was thrown off his feet as though someone had just hit him with a sledgehammer. "Shit." Train yelled. He slung Issei's left arm around his shoulders and used his magic to speed them off toward the building. As Train put him down, Issei could feel a searing pain spreading from his right shoulder and down his arm. Train sat the young devil against a wall and began putting pressure on the bullet wound in his shoulder. "That sniper was waiting for us," Train said. "This confirms our suspicions. They must have found Hyoudou and Jonah out." He stopped putting pressure on the wound to take off Issei's windbreaker and shirt. "Looks like the bullet went clean through. The hole isn't too big, they must have used a smaller caliber round. Any larger and you would probably be dead," Train assessed. "Still, if we don't get you help fast, you'll die of blood loss regardless." He took a small first aid kit out of a pocket within his jacket and began to wrap gauze under Issei's armpit and around his shoulder. He finished it off by wrapping it around the devil's chest twice before ripping it off the roll from the remaining gauze and tying it tight. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm alright," Issei said through gritted teeth. "I highly doubt you're alright," Train retorted as he put Issei's good arm around his shoulders once again to help the devil move. As they were walking, Train pulled out a pistol from his coat. "That sniper probably alerted the other men in the area, get ready for a fight." Issei nodded weakly and pulled out his own pistol. They could hear voices from the doorway they had entered through and began to move faster. As they were walking down a long hallway, a voice screamed out from the end they had just come from. "Over here, I found them." Issei lifted his gun and fired off 3 shots blindly toward the voice. The act of lifting his injured arm so quickly and the recoil of the weapon sent a fresh wave of intense pain up through his shoulder. Bullets peppered the wall next to them just as they rounded the corner. Issei's vision was turning blurry and the sounds around him grew distant. Suddenly, one of the doors lining the hallway swung open. "In here." A gruff voice called out. Crane dragged Issei into the apartment and propped him against the wall once again as the door closed behind them. Issei lifted his head to see Jonah standing at the door, peering through the peephole. As Hyoudou came over, she caught sight of Issei and adopted a horrified expression. "Oh God," she whispered as she hurried to his side and put a hand on his wound. Her hand began to glow a soft green, and the steady flow of blood that had been pouring from his shoulder slowed to a stop. Once Issei's condition was stabilized, Train turned to Jonah. "Why the hell are there snipers in the middle of an urban area?" he whispered urgently. Jonah looked through the peephole once before looking back at Jonah. He didn't dare raise his voice above a whisper, not with so many Yakuza in the building. "They found out we were here to start trouble. We were attacked shortly after our last report and lost most of our equipment. The bastards were probably watching us the moment we entered their territory," he said. "After we got away they cordoned off the entire neighborhood, no one goes in or out. No wonder they were so quick to shoot, that also explains why this entire area seems deserted." Train remarked. "Why aren't the police doing anything?" Jonah gave a dry laugh. "They own the police in this part of the country," he said. Train looked down at Hyoudou, her hand still over Issei's wound. "Can he move?" the fixer asked. Hyoudou looked back up at him with worry still clear on her face. "He's lost a lot of blood, but it should be okay to carry him," she replied. Train nodded. "Our car isn't too far from here. If we make a break for it, we might just make it out of here alive." Hyoudou took Train's previous position, slinging one of Issei's arm over her shoulder to help him walk. The other two fixers drew their guns and prepared to move. They threw open the door and began to move down the hallway Train and Issei had come from. 3 shots around a corner cleared the way as they began to pick up speed. 2 more shots, they were out the main door. Yakuza members began to fire at them as they ran for the car. Train and Jonah were letting loose a constant barrage of bullets by the time they reached the vehicle. Hyoudou laid Issei down in the back seat before sitting next to him. She ducked down low as 2 bullets shattered the window behind her. Train slid over the hood and got in on the driver's side. Blood spewed out onto the roof of the car as Jonah let out a grunt before getting in the passenger's seat. They were speeding down the road within seconds. "Hyoudou, my arm," Jonah said as a look of pain washed over his face. Hyoudou put her hand over a hole in Jonah's left bicep. There was a soft green glow, and when she pulled away there was no evidence of the wound. "You should be fine," she said as she put Issei's head on her lap. She brushed his sweat-drenched hair out of his face, and her eyes widened slightly. "Interesting," she whispered as she examined Issei once again. Hours later, Saratobi opened the door to find her team standing outside. However, her smile quickly fell when she saw Jonah carrying a sleeping Issei. "He should be fine," Hyoudou said, noticing the worry on Saratobi's face. "He just needs a bit of sleep." The woman nodded. "Let's put him to bed and get you all debriefed then." After 2 hours of reviewing the events in Amori, most of the tired members of Kronos went off to bed. As Saratobi was about to leave, Hyoudou grabbed her arm. "We need to talk," she said. They both sat down at the kitchen table again. "When I was healing Issei, I noticed something peculiar," Hyoudou began. "The majority of his magical circuits have been destroyed." Saratobi looked down at the table. "I know, he told me they were damaged when we first brought him here." "It's not just that," Hyoudou said. "Well, there are a number of ways to damage your magical circuits. I have never seen anything like this before." Saratobi gave the Hyoudou a quizzical look. "What do you mean?" "His magical circuits weren't simply damaged beyond repair, most were utterly destroyed," the healer explained. "It's as if someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail inside his magic reserves." I can only imagine how painful the process must have been. Saratobi was shocked. She hadn't thought much of it when Issei told her that his circuits were shot. Someone with that much power was bound to overexert themselves one too many times and pop a fuse, but she hadn't been expecting something to this degree. "What could have possibly done that?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Hyoudou replied, "but I think some of them may be salvageable. With any luck he can get some of his magic back. Sadly, he'll never have as much magic at his disposal as he once did." Saratobi contemplated for a moment. "We'll tell him once he recovers," she decided. "Alright then," Hyoudou agreed. "I better get some rest. If we go through with this, the procedure will require of magical energy." "Alright then, good night, Hyoudou," Saratobi said. "Night, Sachan," the girl replied. With that, Hyoudou went to her room and Saratobi was alone. "Issei Hyoudou," she thought, "what an interesting man." Issei could hear garbled voices before he even opened his eyes. As he regained his senses, he could clearly hear a woman's voice. "Very painful, maybe we should have done it while he was asleep," the voice he could now identify as Hyoudou said. "I told you already, I want to discuss it with him before we do anything to his body. We at least need his permission first," he could hear Saratobi say. Issei cracked his eyes open to see Hyoudou, Saratobi, and Connor standing at the foot of his bed. "It's not as though we're doing anything harmful, quite the opposite actually," Hyoudou remarked. "I think it's a moot point now," Connor said. "He's awake." They all turned toward Issei, and Sarutobi gave a smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "A bit dizzy, but other than that I'm good as new," he replied. "You lost a lot of blood. You'll need to rest for a few days, but you should be fine," Haru said. "Really? That's impressive, thanks," Haru, Issei remarked. The girl in question blushed. "No problem," she said. "So Issei Connor began, it turns out Haru might be able to repair a few of your magical circuits." Issei looked over at Haru with wide eyes. "Really?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "I got an in-depth look at them when I was healing your wound. It is possible that I can salvage a few, but I can't promise anything." "Good thing you got shot, otherwise we may have never found out," Connor added cheerfully. "I wouldn't necessarily call it good," Issei grumbled. "We were waiting until you woke up before we did anything," Sarutobi explained, ignoring his comment. "With your permission, we can start right away." Issei nodded, "Of course." "Alright then," Haru said as she walked up to the side of Issei's bed. The way she was looking at him made the young devil feel as though he were a specimen she was about to dissect. "This will probably hurt a lot," she said as she put her hand on Issei's forehead. The green light emanated from between her fingers, and instantly Issei felt pain shoot through his body. Issei squeezed his eyes shut and ground his teeth. It felt like light spears were stabbing every part of his body. The pain was unbearable. It continued on for another 15 minutes. "Finished?" Haru finally gasped as she pulled her hand away and wiped the sweat from her brow. "I was only able to fix a select few, the rest have no chance of ever being used again," she reported. "It's going to take a day or two before your magic reserves start to fill again. Just remember you won't have even close to the amount of power you once had." Sarutobi walked up to him with a plate of bacon and eggs she had brought from the kitchen, while Haru worked. "I'll bring you your food, make sure you get some rest," she ordered. Issei nodded his thanks, and the other members of Kronos left his room. After eating his breakfast, Issei retrieved his phone and, with nothing better to do, began to browse through the pictures once again. He couldn't help but recall the events after his banishment. As they carted Issei away in his little metal box, Issei could still hear the taunts and curses being thrown at him from the devils standing outside the courtroom. He was reviled by the very people he had tried to save. How ironic. They took him to a gateway between the human world and the underworld. However, before he was cast back into the human world, the cart stopped and an older man entered the metal box with Issei. The man had thinning gray hair, large wire-frame glasses, and a white lab coat. His hand glowed an ominous blue and without a word, he shoved his hand through Issei's chest. Without puncturing the skin, his hand passed through the skin and explored the younger devil's chest. Eventually he wrapped his fingers around a set of objects, and Issei felt as though his soul was being crushed in the man's hand. He felt that if the man squeezed too hard, he would disappear and cease to exist. The man gave an experimental tug before tearing the objects out. The pain was unimaginable. Issei's entire world was consumed by it, and he saw nothing but red. He didn't know how long he had been screaming, but eventually his throat gave out and his vision slowly returned. When he looked up, he saw the man walking out of the cart with 8 pawn pieces grasped firmly in his hand. Once the man had left, 2 of the burly devils that had initially thrown him into the cart dragged him out again. They pulled him through the passage and back into the human world. The sun blinded Issei as they crossed over. After a short walk, the guards unceremoniously threw the wounded devil onto a sidewalk outside of the train station Rias had used when she first took him to the demon world. The entire station was devoid of life. Issei couldn't see a single person. He sat on the hard concrete for an hour before he had the strength to move again. After this, he began to stumble home. His parents were out, probably at work. He went up to his room and gathered all the money he had saved throughout the years. "I can't be so close to an entrance to the devil world. Most of the devils hate me. I wouldn't put it past them to try to kill me," Issei thought. "What if they hurt mom and dad? Or one of my friends from school? It isn't safe here anymore." After he gathered his life savings, he stuffed as much as he could into a backpack. Clothes, food, his phone and a charger. "I can't force mom and dad to leave the life they've built here. They would have to start over in a different city. I don't think they can even afford to do that." He walked out of the front door. "I have to go alone," he concluded. A knock on the door brought him back to reality. Sarutobi was standing there with his lunch in her hand. "Reminiscing again?" she asked. Issei gave a half-hearted smile. "Yeah. Sarutobi walked in and sat on the edge of the bed, placing his lunch next to him. "It's not good to dwell on the past," she said. "You should look toward the future more." "I guess you're right," Issei sighed. "Of course I am," she replied with a smile. She noticed the phone lying next to Issei, its screen still displaying a picture with him and Rias' peerage. "Who are they?" she asked. "They're the other devils of the peerage I was in," Issei explained. "Ah, so you're a stray then?" Sarutobi remarked. "I guess you could say that," he replied. "What do you mean?" she asked with a confused look. Issei picked up a sandwich from the plate. "I never ran away from my master, I was removed from her peerage," he said. "What did you do to deserve that?" she questioned. "I'd rather not talk about," Issei replied, and silence enveloped the room. After a moment, Sarutobi got up. Just remember my offer still stands, if you ever want to talk I'm here she said. With that, she left the room and Issei was alone again. Issei finished his lunch and put the plate on the floor next to his bed. A few minutes later he drifted off to sleep and dreamed of his banishment once again. The only difference was this time, every devil that was cursing him as he walked out of the courtroom had Ria's face. Issei woke up the next morning feeling much better than yesterday. He swung his legs off the bed and got up. The young devil pulled on a shirt and a pair of sweatpants before walking downstairs. "You look better," Jonah called from the kitchen. "Yeah, I feel great," Issei replied. "Good to hear," the man said as he held out a plate of bacon. Issei took a piece and sat at the table as he chewed on it. "How about you? You got shot in the arm?" asked. Jonah waved him off. "Barry's magic works wonders. She fixed me up in just a few seconds," he said. Jonah patted Issei on the shoulder as he took the remaining bacon to his room. "Keep up the good work," Kitty shouted from the stairs. The young devil looked down at his hands. Had he done good work? He wasn't any use on his first job with Train, and he became a burden when he was shot on the rescue mission. He balled his hands into fists. "I need to get stronger," he thought to himself. With new resolution found, he went up to Saratobi's room and knocked on the door. What greeted him on the other side was a surprise to say the least. The woman opened the door while fixing her hair wrapped in only a loose towel. "Ah, Issei, how are you?" she questioned. The young man was still frozen in shock. "Issei?" she asked again. "Oh, I wanted to talk to you," the devil said, shaking off his surprise and looking down at his feet. Saratobi was confused for a moment, she looked down, and then realization washed over her. The young woman gave a devious smile. "Come on in," she said and stepped to the side. Issei brushed past her through the door, her chest pressing against him as he went by. He blushed further before sitting down on the chair by her desk. "So what did you want to talk about?" she began. "I want to train more, not just in shooting either. I was nothing but a burden on the missions I went on with Train. I don't want to be a liability to the group," he confessed. Saratobi put her hands on Issei's shoulders and looked him in the eyes. "You are not a burden," she said sternly, "everyone has trouble at first. All you have to do is keep working and you will get better. No one here expects you to get everything right away, remember that." Issei stared at her for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered. Saratobi smiled. "Now about your training, we can start hand-to-hand combat tomorrow. I don't want to push you so soon after recovery, so relax today." Issei nodded and got up to leave. Before he could get through the door, Saratobi grabbed his arm. "You have so much potential, Issei, remember that," she said kindly. After that, Issei went down to the living room and flipped on the television in an effort to kill time. After an hour of stand-up comedy that wasn't really funny, Haru sat down on the sofa opposite of him. She examined him for a few minutes before finally speaking. "Have you felt any activity with your magic circuits yet?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Issei said. "When you do, tell me. We need to put you through therapy to allow them to heal properly," she explained. "What kind of therapy?" he asked. "We just need to exercise your circuits a bit. It's the same concept as physical therapy in that we want you to gain strength before you do any heavy lifting with your magic," she replied. "I'll set up and run you through these exercises. Under my watch you'll be good as new in no time." Issei smiled at her. "I don't doubt it, I've only seen healing as good as yours once before." Haru blushed slightly. "It isn't that amazing, doing it for too long leaves me exhausted. It still is an amazing power though, I only wish I could be as helpful as you are," Issei countered. "You will be," she said, "it just takes a little time." Sachan said the same thing, Issei remarked. The healer nodded. "Of course she did, she wouldn't have brought you to us if it were any different." The devil flipped the channel to a rerun of Senju no Valkyria. "I'll be sure to get stronger," he thought, then, maybe, this might be a new place to call home. The next day, Issei woke ready to improve himself. He quickly took a shower and changed. When he walked downstairs and found Saratobi already waiting for him with 2 duffel bags. "An old friend of mine is letting us use his dojo to practice," and she said as she tossed him one of the bags. He looked inside and saw a plain guy with a matching white belt to hold it together. "We're going to be training in Taekwondo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu." A bit of background. Taekwondo is focused on fighting with your hands and feet, while Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a more aggressive version of traditional Jiu-Jitsu. "I'm assuming you know what Jiu-Jitsu is about, right?" she asked. She leaned forward next to his ear. "Full body contact," she whispered. Issei instantly turned red and Saratobi let out a laugh at his expense. After they arrived at the small dojo they quickly changed into their gi and stretched to begin training. "Alright then," Saratobi began, "let's begin with the basics." She spread her feet apart slightly and put her fists in front of her face. "Always keep your guard up," she instructed, "you can't leave an opening." She punched out at Issei. "Hey," he said as he barely dodged. "Hands up," she shouted, "no openings." She another took a swipe at him. "Higher. Do you want your paste to look like a smashed tomato?" she quipped. He raised his fists and she jabbed him in the ribs, and the force behind the punch surprised him. "Elbows in," she ordered. She continued to press him, pushing him closer to the wood wall of the dojo. "Feet further apart. You need a firm base," she continued. Issei tried to step away from the direction of the wall, but the moment he crossed his feet to move she was on him. "Never give up your balance," she yelled as she shoved him and he tripped over himself, ending the fight. "It seems you have a lot to learn," the young woman said as she crouched beside him. They went at it like this for the next 2 hours. Issei noticed that Sarutobi had a very peculiar way of teaching. She would beat him and point out his mistakes until he figured out how to counter her. Then, she would switch up her fighting style slightly and they would repeat the process. Once they were done, Issei was left an exhausted heap on the ground. He felt something cool touch his face and looked up to see Sarutobi holding 2 bottles of water in her hands. He gratefully took one and began to all but inhale the life-giving liquid. "Good work today," she said, smiling down at him. The young woman offered Issei her hand and pulled him up. "Let's head home, we can work more tomorrow," she said. They packed their things and got in the car for the ride home. Issei slept most of the way. Sarutobi looked over to the softly breathing devil as she drove and grinned to herself, "What an interesting man." Issei cracked his eyes open the next morning to the familiar side of his room. A soft light poured in through the window and signaled the new day. He stretched before slowly sitting up in his bed. He was still slightly sore from his training with Sarutobi the day before. He reminded himself that he had to do that again today and got up to take a shower. After drying himself off and getting dressed, he headed down for breakfast. "Are you kidding me? We pretty much invented it. America would crush Japan," Issei could hear Connor declare. "I wouldn't be too sure," Jonah retorted, "we refined it over here. Japan is far more skilled when it comes to this. Please. It took you guys more than a century to even understand the rules, even then an American had to teach you," Connor said. Issei walked into the kitchen and both men looked over to him. "Perfect. Issei can help us decide," the blonde said, "which is better at baseball. Japan or America?" "I'm not sure how I should answer that," Issei said nervously as the 2 men looked at him expectantly. "Easy, it's Japan," Jonas stated. "The US, damn it," Connor yelled. "Calm down boys, I can't have you wearing Issei down so early in the morning," Sarutobi intervened from the living room. She walked in and looked over to the devil. "Let's head out, we can get an early start," she said. Issei nodded gratefully and followed her out to the car. "Thanks for that," he said. "Anytime," the young woman replied. Once they got to the dojo they got dressed in their gi and prepared for another training session. "So let's do a little background before we begin." Sarutobi began. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu began when a Japanese instructor opened a school for the art in Brazil. His focus was on practical use in combat, disposing with many of the formalities with standard judo. Issei nodded and she continued. "As you probably know, this fighting style revolves around grappling and full contact. Strength isn't everything in this one, the focus is maneuvering around your opponent and causing extreme harm with as little exertion as possible." She patted the ground and motioned for Issei to kneel down. "There are generally 2 positions when you are grappling. The mount and the guard," she said as she got on her back and wrapped her legs around Issei's waist. "From here, both of us are in each other's guard. Neither of us have an advantage over the other in this position, but if we were to flip the other into the mount, whoever is on top has far more opportunities to subdue their opponent." She unhooked her legs and kneeled in front of Issei. "Let's get started. We're going to put our backs together and when I say go, you have to either pin your opponent from the mount or force them to tap out. Got it?" Once Issei nodded, they put their backs together. 3, 2, 1, go," she announced. They immediately got to their feet and faced each other. "Remember, just like yesterday you want to leave no opening," Sarutobi said. "In general, whoever can get lowest wins in this kind of fight." At that Issei adopted a lower stance. Faster than his eye could follow, the young woman darted forward and put her right foot behind Issei's left heel. She grabbed onto the collar of his gi with her left hand and used her right to push him back, throwing him to the floor. Issei barely managed to wrap his legs around her to get the woman in his guard before she was on the ground in an attempt to press her advantage. Right away, she stood up, keeping him firmly on the floor by pushing down on his center directly over the belt, keeping his gi together. His legs were forced to unhook and she quickly latched onto the one resting on her left shoulder. She leaned in, pressing his knee toward his chest, and quickly slid on top and straddled him putting her into the mount. Issei used his superior strength and flipped he onto her back, placing him into her guard. "Very good, Issei," Sarutobi praised. However, she quickly thrust her hips up, causing Issei to fall on his hands and knees on top of her. She latched onto his chest, hooked her foot behind his calf, and rolled to put her back into his mount. As quickly as the fight began, it ended. The young woman twisted Issei's arm and forced him to tap out and concede defeat. They were both breathing heavily as Sarutobi sat straddling Issei's waist, her hair falling on either side of her face as she looked down at him. She stilled as she realized how close she was to him. She could feel the heat radiating off his chest from the workout. Sarutobi couldn't help but think about what a marvel the devil was. Although he hadn't told her very much about his past, she knew he had suffered greatly. Yet he was still so kind and considerate. Here he was, training so that he might not be a burden to his comrades, not a single selfish thought running through his head. How glad she was that she had pulled him off the street. How glad she was to have found such an amazing man. Issei, she whispered as she lowered her face closer to his. Their lips were inched apart. Sarui, he began. He was cut off as she pressed her lips to his. After a moment, Issei returned the kiss in full. Soon she pulled away slightly and looked down at him again. I'm so glad I took you in, she said softly. Now that you're with us, I won't let anything take you away. Issei once again woke up to the roof of his room, just as he had the previous days. Light through the window illuminated it and told him it was still early. However, this time as he went to sit up, he found something holding him down. Looking down, he saw Sarutobi lying on top of him with her head on his chest. She snuggled closer to the devil in her sleep. He smiled as he admired her, but a moment later he almost let out a yelp. As he looked further down, he noticed that she was clad only in a bra and a pair of lacy panties, and he in his boxers. Sarutobi slowly shifted and opened her eyes. Morning, she yawned as she looked up at Issei and smiled. Issei smiled back at her. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sarutobi flashed him a panicked look before pulling the covers over her head and pressing herself against the devil. Haru opened the door and walked in. Good morning, Issei, she said. Hey Haru, what do you need? He asked nervously. I wanted to know if your magical circuits have started working once again, she said. I don't know, I don't think I can cast any magic at the moment though. Issei said. The healer put her hand to her chin and examined the young devil. Try looking deep within yourself, she suggested. They probably aren't producing enough to allow you to use magic, but that doesn't mean they're not working. You should be able to tell if you concentrate on them. Issei closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Sure enough, he could feel the slight trickle of magical energy flowing through him. Yeah, I feel something, he said after a moment. Wonderful, once you regain enough magic to work with we can start you therapy, she replied. Braid Issei gasped as he felt Sarutobi start planting kisses on his chest and running a hand on his stomach. Haru's face grew concerned. Are you okay? She asked, misinterpreting his reaction as pain. She walked over and put her hand on his forehead. You shouldn't work yourself too hard, she said. I won't, he said as he felt Sarutobi's hand pass below the belt. Alright, come down to breakfast soon, she said with a slight smile. She walked out of the room and down the stairs. A minute after she left, Issei threw back his covers. Not funny? He whispered. The young woman gave him a sly smile. I thought it was hilarious, she said. Issei sat up and stretched. Do we have any training today? He asked. I think we should take the day off, she replied as she ran her finger down his chest. Let's save that for after breakfast, he said as he swung his legs out of the bed. You're no fun, she pouted. Issei pulled on a pair of pants and walked down to the kitchen. Fun night? Jonah asked with a knowing smile. Issei stumbled over himself trying to make an excuse, and the man just laughed. Don't worry, he said, I'm the only one that knows. The devil sighed in relief. How did you find out? He asked. Believe it or not, I was your age once too, Jonah remarked. I wasn't one to say no to a kind lady either, at least until I got married, that is. You're married? Issei questioned. I was. My wife died years ago, he said sadly. The older man picked up a plate stacked with pancakes and turned back toward Issei. Now isn't the time for sob stories though. I got 10 of these things and I can't eat them all myself. Issei smiled and grabbed his own plate. Eventually the other members of Kronos filed down into the kitchen and sat down at the table. We should get another job soon, Train said between mouthfuls of pancake. We can't have the company running out of money. I'll look into it later today, Connor replied. Train stopped eating for a moment and his face grew serious. I still wonder, how could the Yakuza have found Haru and Jonah out on their last mission? He said. Haru nodded. It is suspicious, she added. We can worry about that later, Sarutobi said cheerfully. For now let's just focus on our next job. They all nodded and continued to eat their breakfast. For the remainder of the day, the members of Kronos relaxed around the house. Issei spent the day on the laptop in his room he bought with money from the company. He found himself repeatedly going back to the Kuo Academy school website. He missed his old life and he knew he always would. However, he had found something new here. He was building a new life with Kronos. Now he had Sarutobi, Train, Haru, Jonah and Connor. Even though he missed his old friends, he had found new ones. Maybe things wouldn't be so bad. Issei lay awake in bed that night. A few hours after everyone else had gone to sleep, Sarutobi snuck into his room and crawled in bed with him. She kissed him and rested on his side as she drifted asleep. Slowly he let his consciousness slip away as well. He found himself floating in an abyss. Darkness surrounded him. He heard a voice calling out, but he couldn't make out what it was saying. It continued to float as the voice grew louder and louder. Suddenly, it became clear it was someone he knew well. "Glad to have you back, partner." Issei shot up, breathing heavily with sweat pouring down his face and chest. "Issei? Are you alright?" Saratobi asked with worry in her voice. The young boy looked down at his hand and said one word. "Reg." Off in another part of Japan, a woman was finished working behind her desk after another long day. Seemingly for no reason she stood up and dropped her pen, startling the young woman standing behind her. She felt a signal far away, the last of the master servant pact burning away as his magic was restored. But from the embers a single spark let out that last signal. It wasn't enough to give her an exact location, but she was able to target the general location. Looking toward the direction the signal came from, she smiled excitedly. "I'm coming," my Issei as Gremory declared. End of the here. So that's it for today's video guys. Before you go, just like the video and share it with your friends. Bye.